I'm Danielle, and welcome to This Enchanted House. So, for our first ever Exploring an Aesthetic, Steampunk! Steampunk is one of my core aesthetics. If you've watched my What is My Aesthetic video, it's one of those things that crosses a lot of boundaries and stuff, and I figured we'd just explore what steampunk is today. So if you've never heard of steampunk, I hope this is helpful, and if you are into steampunk, I hope maybe you can learn something new, or if you want to share your experiences down below in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. So what is steampunk? Well, the best concise definition is a retro-futurist Victoriana with a focus on technology and the Industrial Revolution. And that's like a lot of words that may not have meaning for everybody in the same way. So let's kind of just break that down. So first up is retrofuturist. Futurist is basically speculative fiction that's written today that, guesses what the future will be like. So retrofuturist imagines if the technology of today or the technology of the near future was available in past times. So, if, airplanes were around during the Civil War, or if gunpowder came earlier to medieval Europe, or stuff like that. Also, it's sometimes also applied as applying historic aesthetics to modern or futuristic settings, so having a space station in the year 2040, but it's all very Victorian and has lots of curlicues and stuff, or so it can work both ways. So Victoriana is an aesthetic that covers the reign of Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria ruled England from 1837 to 1901, and she is the second longest ruling monarch of Great Britain, with the current Queen Elizabeth being the longest. So it covers actually a really long period in history, and some people even stretch it out further and to include, from when she was born, all the way into her son's rule, which is Edwardian, which takes us all the way up to World War I. So it's a huge period. And fashions change fairly quickly over this period. You can usually go kind of by decade. So, but you're thinking bustles and corsets and big skirts on women, men in very tailored suits. You're thinking brick buildings, the herbaceous furniture, heavy woods, dark colors, but also bright colors. And in terms of architecture, this is when we get like the Queen Anne and the Gothic revivals here in the U.S., this sort of over-the-top architecture. So, and then the last thing is the Industrial Revolution. When we think of the Industrial Revolution, it's actually divided into two parts. And the first part is the Industrial Revolution that takes place from the 1760s to the 1840s. And this is the introduction of the steam engine and the idea of factories and mass production gets introduced in this period, and it starts to really change the landscape. And this is the landscape changing from agrarian to industrial. The second Industrial Revolution is usually the 1870s to up until, once again, World War I. We see all that in technology from the first Industrial Revolution kind of becomes the standard. Factories become very commonplace. Steam engines are used all over the place. And we see a bunch of other new technologies because of this, including things like electricity and the telegraph and telephone and the phonograph and the automobile and the airplane all kind of come out of this period. These new technologies that were only made possible by the previous Industrial Revolution. Steampunk tends to concentrate on that second one because it lines up very nicely with Queen Victoria, because the earlier takes place actually what we think of in the U.S. as the colonial period and into the Regency, the early 1800s. When you say the Industrial Revolution, people usually think more of the second part, but just to clarify, it does start way earlier. In steampunk, we're concentrated kind of more towards the second Industrial Revolution, the one that really lines up with Victoria's rule, though even her rule kind of starts just at the end of the first one. So steampunk, like a lot of things, is a genre, is a lifestyle, is an aesthetic, and is a subculture. And we're going to kind of talk about all those. If you're not sure what the difference between all of those are, I do have a convenient video if you want to go check out the definitions of each of those and how they differ and how they overlap. But we're going to start with genre, because steampunk largely starts out as a type of genre of fiction. It comes out of the cyberpunk genre in the 70s and the 80s, and some of these authors start saying, hey, what if we take this kind of... Cyberpunk is a futurist genre that predicted that, you know, we'd be living in a computer-controlled dystopia come, like, in the 2020s. Oh, they were so off, right? But seriously, it was a futurist examining, and steampunk was sort of taking those ideas and making them retrofuturist. So we don't really see the word steampunk appear until the 1980s, and in particular, K.W. Jeter coins the term to describe his works and some other works that are kind of taking the cyberpunk genre, but making it retrofuturist. He wrote books like Morlock Knight and The Infernal Devices, and he uses it. The first time it appears in print is he writes to Locus Magazine, which was a science fiction magazine, and uses the word steampunk to describe what him and other authors were doing, and it kind of sticks. And steampunk as a genre grows. In terms of literature, there's a lot of steampunk books out there. We might think of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Mary Shelley, some of these writers as steampunk, but the truth is they are futurist authors writing in their time. At the time they were written, they were speculative, but they go on to kind of inform how steampunk novels look and how they thought the future would go. So we kind of include them, but they're technically not steampunk because they were written well before steampunk. Probably the seminal novel that kind of defines the genre is called The Difference Engine by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, which is imagines if Charles Babbage was successful with his difference engine, which is historically considered the first computer, though he was never successful in getting it working and bringing it into the mainstream. And they said, well, what if he did? What if we had computing as early as, 1860, 1870? What would that look like? But there's a lot of steampunk novels out there. Some of my favorites include the Ministry of Peculiar Occurrences series by Pitt Ballantyne and T. Morris, The Parasol Protectorate by Gail Carriger, the Leviathan series by Scott Westerfield, and the Gaslight Chronicles by our own local Michigan author, Cindy Spencer Pape. Now, as a genre, steampunk didn't translate as well to the screen. As I mentioned in my video on my aesthetic, I talked about Hayao Miyazaki and how a lot of his movies influenced steampunk, but were actually kind of came out before steampunk was a thing, like Nausicaa Valley of the Wind. Or if they came out after, something like Howl's Moving Castle has steampunk elements in it, but it isn't necessarily a steampunk movie. There is one very good anime called Steam Boy by Katsuhiro Otome. I'm gonna write down below me so because I'm probably mispronouncing it. It is a beautiful work. It's actually just an enjoyable story to watch, and I'll put a link below to maybe places where you can find it. Meanwhile, the Western film steampunk just didn't seem to translate well. We've got League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Wild Wild West, Sucker Punch, and while these movies aesthetically, I love them, there is Guy Ritchie's newest version of Sherlock Holmes with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law, which is definitely steampunk and is definitely gorgeous. And the place where steampunk maybe did best was once again in the animation realm, especially at Disney. There are classic Disney movies like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which are, like once again when we talk about Jules Verne, they aren't steampunk because they came out before steampunk, but they definitely, fit within the realm of steampunk. But the animated studio came out with, Atlantis and Treasure Planet, which are both have definite steampunk vibes going on. Also, the Disney parks have kind of really embraced steampunk subtly. in things like the Society of Explorers and Adventurers, which is a secret society within the lore of the Disney parks. It is the basis of Disney Sea in Tokyo, but actually that park was based on an original park designed to go where Galaxy's Edge now is in Disneyland, which would be sort of a steampunk adventure type park. Things we could have had. Not that Galaxy's Edge is great. I haven't actually been yet. I'm excited to go, but steampunk park. Hopefully I'll get to go to Tokyo someday and see that one. But even in Disney World and Disneyland, there's hints of sea. It started as part of the kernel for it was actually the Adventures Club in Disney World, which closed, but it's actually now the Edison, which is a steampunk themed restaurant, so still steampunk. So yeah, in the screen as a genre, it didn't survive. There's also a genre of steampunk music, but I'm going to actually talk about that when I get to aesthetic, because it kind of is interesting how it works, and it's actually more about aesthetic than it is about the music itself. So let's talk about steampunk as a lifestyle. Steampunk as a lifestyle really didn't catch off. There was kind of when it was at its peak in the early mid 2000s, into like about 2010, like that decade, it kind of got there, but never quite. But there is a very huge sort of maker DIY ethos within steampunk. It comes from the fact that steampunk celebrates this idea of of innovation, but people tinkering and exploring and creating things. The idea of the individual inventor, which is something that's kind of been replaced over time, thanks to Thomas Edison, by the research lab, and you have lots of people coming together, and practically you can make an argument about which is better, but steampunk definitely romanticizes this idea of the lone inventor, this lone genius coming up with ideas. Also, steampunk, because it's one of the things that focus on is with the Industrial Revolution, is that point we see craftsmanship go down and mass production go up, and it's a trade-off, and we're kind of it's at a balance point where things mass produced in the early Industrial Revolution oftentimes were still made by hand, but like on an assembly line, or where parts were made by a machine and then combined together by hand. There's this idea in steampunk of things being handcrafted or high quality when it comes to crafting. So combined with the lone the lone tinkerer, the lone inventor, the lone genius, you get this emphasis on craftsmanship and doing it yourself. So there were people who tried to live a Victorian lifestyle depending only on steam, which is kind of weird. Let me put it this way, there's a very easy cheat. Actually, most electricity is still steam generated. It's steam generators that create electricity. It's an invention by Nikola Tesla. Lifestyle-wise, steampunk is a lifestyle. Most people, there are people who do sort of an everyday steampunk dress where they dress kind of Victorian-ish inspired, sort of a history-bounding type style maybe. But otherwise, and they maybe embrace kind of Victorian manners and dress. They have afternoon tea. They home cook everything. Don't process foods. Try not to use technologies before 1914, or if they do, they disguise them. There was a brilliant steampunk artist named Datamancer who did computer equipment like monitors and cases and keyboards, and they're beautiful and they're gorgeous and they're functional. I'm also very pricey. He passed away, but his family still sells replicas of his work if you wanted to have a steampunk computer, which I desperately do. Not there yet. So let's talk about steampunk as a subculture. For me, steampunk subculture mostly resembles fandom culture. You love this aesthetic, you love the genre, you love the maker part of it. There's all these elements. And some people are really into the genre, but not so much into the aesthetic and the lifestyle. Some people are really into the lifestyle, but not so much into the genre. But they kind of all come together over this shared love of this sort of Venn diagram where they all kind of come together. The steampunk community is maybe not as vibrant as it was when steampunk was at its peak. I would say steampunk kind of peaks around 2005 into 2010. IBM famously said, steampunk's going to be the next big thing, and it kind of was. And then I think partly because there was all those steampunk movies and they didn't do well, people were like, oh, steampunk's kind of not a thing now, because that's like was the most visual version of steampunk. But there's still some really great, vibrant steampunk communities out there. I am lucky enough to live in Michigan, which has still a very vibrant, still very active steampunk community. Not so much the past year because of COVID, but I personally belong to a group called the Monroe Steam Salon. We meet, about once a month, and we have different activities. We do a picnic over the summer. We do RPGs, which is actually, I guess, if you want to go back to genre, there are steampunk RPGs. We've played through the Breach, which is steampunk, but also like Victorian horrors. Is based off of another tabletop game called Malifaux, which is more like a strategy game. We're gonna do Firefly. Firefly isn't technically steampunk. It's space cowboy, but because the cowboy part of it's sort of kind of Victorian-ish, it kind of falls into steampunk, though there's also some like super futuristic stuff. So I guess going back to genre, there are things that kind of cross into steampunk genre but aren't actually considered steampunk. Our group started because local downtown businesses decided to have what they call the First Friday, which is sort of a themed event. Then all the stores would have little things going on, and it was supposed to attract people downtown. And the first Friday of their first February First Friday was themed steampunk. And I went, and a bunch of other people went, and some of us kind of knew each other, but we didn't either know we knew them from other geeky things, but we didn't know they were in the steampunk, or we knew them from steampunk, but we didn't know they lived in Monroe. So it was great, and we realized there were a lot of us living here in Monroe, so we formed our own group. There are a lot of other groups around here, including Capital Steam, Detroit Steampunk Collective. I'm going to give a shout out to another group, which is the Airship Ashanti. They are not local to Michigan, they're from Ohio. They do excellent cosplays, but they do steampunk crossover cosplays, and if you are ever in an event, they are always amazing to see what they come up with next. And the other reason I'm bringing it up is because airships. Airships are sort of a huge element of steampunk, this kind of futurist idea of like, what if they had airships back then? And what if that had been more of a way of transportation? What if air travel had been possible in, the 1860s, the 1870s, 1880s? So most steampunk groups do have associated airships. For the Monroe Steam Salon, ours is the airship Libby Custer. We don't actually physically have airships. We do have flags, and usually people take on roles as officers and stuff. A lot of recent Michigan steampunk events, usually, so a lot of times you'll see this board where they have your airship can check in, or they'll have an airship parade, usually at the beginning of the event, at the opening ceremonies. They'll have all the airships. You come out with your crew and your flags, and you march through, and then announce your ship. But yeah, airships are kind of a way for steampunk groups to label themselves, so they can take any form. And bringing up events, so there are steampunk conventions. The biggest ones are probably, nearest me at least, the biggest ones are probably TeslaCon and the Steam Symposium. Michigan has had Steam conventions in various forms. My first actual steampunk convention was the World Steam Expo. I attended it all year, every year they had it but one. Since then, it's cycled through with different groups trying to put one on, and it's had different names. The current group of people trying to do it, who I know, and I think once they actually can get going on it, will do a really good job, because they've had experience doing the other ones and other cons that are to take place in Michigan, is the Michigan Steam Expo. And they did sort of a trial con in 1919, and it went really well, and I really enjoyed it, and I got this beautiful bodice chain, among other things, and I had a really good time. So I'm hoping, 2022, I don't know what they're, or if I haven't heard recently. I hope they're able to go forward with it. But even that, Michigan has a great active steampunk community that, meets on, there's usually, you can find steampunk things going on at least some of the time. So let's talk about what this channel is all about, steampunk aesthetic. So the aesthetic is Victoriana meets industrial with a good amount of punk thrown in. So you see a lot of exposed clockwork and gears, a lot of metals and brass, really rich, vibrant colors. Though steampunk is associated with brown, that our view of the Victorian era is colored by the fact that most of the photos are either like black or white or like sepia toned, that sepia brown. So we kind of associate brown with steampunk, and there's a lot of brown in steampunk, but as you can see, you can go very colorful too. So in terms of appearance, there's this idea of combining Victorian elements with modern elements. So in particular, wearing a corset on the outside, that is not something they did in Victorian age. The corset was akin to having your bra. And we see even today, you know, it makes a statement, people having bras exposed as part of the fashion. Sometimes in combining industrial elements, either through motif, like things like gear motifs, or just donning a pair of goggles. And you'll see the other things, elements like bustle skirts, men with waistcoats, or we'll see, you know, people do like overalls and like sort of work clothes. But they combine it with something more modern or twist it in a way that's kind of, they wouldn't have done it back then, but kind of gives it that punk feel. So in terms of appearance, that's how the aesthetic works. In terms of decor, there are some really interesting examples of steampunk decor out there. My room, this is what we call the Adventurers Club, the dining room, and it's kind of a mishmash of a couple different things, but there's some definite steampunk elements in here, including the steampunk gun behind me. I have this wonderful print of an octopus. And then I wanted to briefly talk about music, because steampunk music is a genre, but it's a genre defined by an aesthetic. So some of the steampunk bands out there are like Abney Park, Steam Powered Giraffe, The Gentleman That Will Be Blamed for Nothing, Professor Elemental, and they're all steampunk, but they all sound very different. Abney Park is sort of this world fusion rock. Steam Powered Giraffe is sort of this techno barbershop quartet type thing going. I think there's only 3 of them though technically, but I don't know. It's this sort of harmonized, old-timey sound, but with more with the sort of technology edge to it. The Gentleman That Will Not Be Blamed for Nothing are sort of a punk rock band. They have sort of very anarchist feel to them. Professor Elemental is a chat pop performer, which is performing rap in the received British pronunciation. And they all have their own sort of story and aesthetic that go with them, but the sound itself is actually can go into different, what we would think of as musical genres. What makes them steampunk is that they've embraced steampunk as an aesthetic, and they featured in their lyrics, and in the way they dress, and the way they present themselves, in the way they tell their band's story. But yeah, so music's kind of where the really interesting crossover between the two. So that's steampunk. That is sort of just an overview. I encourage you to explore more, whether it be through the genre, through the lifestyle makers, or just, you know, dressing up. Or if the subculture, go check out your local steampunk group, check out local steampunk events. Or if you're not in an area that's, honestly, Michigan usually is one of those places where like, oh, there's nobody around, but like, you never know. There's also a lot of online groups you can explore on Facebook, and a lot of steampunk going on Instagram still. So, I hope this was helpful. I would love to hear what you think about steampunk. I'd love to, you know, hear your experiences with it or how you have experienced it. You can comment below. If you like this video, please give it a like. Please check out some of my other videos. If they seem to your taste, subscribe and, you know, stay in the loop. If you want to connect with me on my other social media, I have links to my Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter below. I have a proto Patreon if you are interested in trying to help support this channel and expand what goes on here. I hope you have an enchanted day, and I'll see you guys all next time. Bye!